Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you're tuned in from, and welcome to another session of Pivot 2021. So my name is Jack Kiruja from the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, and I'm working with the Global Geothermal Alliance, which is a multi-stakeholder platform that brings together geothermal stakeholders from around the world to support geothermal development. The Alliance has an aspirational goal of achieving a 5-fold increase in the installed capacity for geothermal power, as well as a 2-fold increase in the installed capacity for geothermal heat. So in today's session, I'm joined by a wonderful panel of geothermal experts, and we're going to be speaking about the role of government in supporting geothermal development and addressing the challenges that are associated with geothermal energy. During this session, we're going to be looking at various levels of government and what role they can play, starting with the local government. This includes the cities and the municipalities. We are also going to be looking at the role of state or the regional governments, depending on which jurisdiction you are in, as well as the role of the federal or the national government. So we're going also to be looking at what impact the various government interventions have on geothermal development. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce the panel for this session, Catherine Young, Paul Ramsack, Alex Fitzsimmons, and Rosalind Archer. I will now ask each one of you to take a minute to give an introduction of who you are, what you do, and how your work is related to geothermal. Catherine Young, you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm Kate Young. I'm a program manager at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory that focuses in the US on advancing the science and engineering of energy efficiency, sustainable transportation, and renewable power technologies. I'm a geologist and an engineer, and I've focused my past research on overcoming technical barriers, everything from exploration to drilling, as well as non-technical barriers, such as permitting and policy that we'll be talking about today. Most recently, I led a non-technical barriers team for the U.S. Department of Energy's GeoVision study, and our results highlighted actions that might be helpful to move the needle in some of these non-technical barriers for geothermal deployment. I look forward to the conversation today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Paul?
Yes, thank you very much, Jack, and hello to everyone out there, wherever you are. My name is Paul Ramsack, working in the Netherlands, the Netherlands Enterprise Agency, which is part of the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Policy. I've been working there for almost 25 years and working on geothermal for the last 20 years. So really starting from zero, basically back then, to the situation where we're in now. Today I'm here also in the capacity of the strategy lead of Geothermica, which is a network of governments basically, mainly in Europe, but recently also the US has joined our network. So basically half of Europe and US at the moment, but we are expanding and we try to accelerate geothermal everywhere.
Thank you very much, Paul. Alex?
All right, thank you, Jack, and hello, everyone. My name is Alex Fitzsimmons. I'm the Senior Director for Renewable Energy and Energy Storage at ClearPath. ClearPath's mission is to develop policies that accelerate breakthrough technologies to reduce CO2 emissions in the electric power and industrial sectors. So prior to joining ClearPath, I worked for almost 4 years at the US Department of Energy in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, where I was the chief of staff and then the deputy assistant secretary. And in that capacity, I oversaw a $1.1 billion R&D portfolio. So I've been involved in a lot of the recent, and at least in the United States, recent federal R&D programs to advance geothermal technology. So I'm really looking forward to today's dialogue. So thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Alex. Rosalind?
Thank you, Jack. Yes, it's a pleasure to be online with everyone today. My name is Rosalind Archer. I'm a professor at the University of Auckland and director of the Geothermal Institute here. I've been directing the Institute for about 8 years, and it is a really multidisciplinary team of academics that look at geothermal very broadly, from engineering and geoscience through to economics, policy, social science, those sorts of things. And I also have the privilege of heading up a master's program called the Master of Energy that again is interdisciplinary, that brings students from science, engineering and business together to look at how to progress renewable energy.
Thank you very much, everybody, for the introductions. And we can already tell that it's a very diverse group of panelists that we have here. So to begin with, I want to start on a global perspective. And here I will be looking at the energy transition, as well as issues related with climate change and climate adaptation. And what we've been seeing recently is that a lot of countries have started putting in place measures to decarbonize their systems, energy systems and other systems of the economy. And with countries, we're seeing the development of long-term and short-term strategies for 2025, 2030, and until 2050, when many countries are thinking of getting to net zero carbon emissions. And it's really encouraging to see that some of the largest economies of the world have also started doing this, which is very encouraging because we also note that some of these countries also have a very large carbon footprint. Apart from that, we also see a lot of countries being engaged in the enhancement and the implementation of their NDCs. As well as more recently, where we are having, due to the COVID, we are having the economic recovery stimulus packages that are being introduced by the government to revive the economies. So the question that I have for all of you is, based on this, what opportunities are you seeing here for geothermal energy in terms of either financing or how geothermal is being inserted into these frameworks? And do you think enough is being done in order to have geothermal play a bigger role in the future in these frameworks? Maybe I can start with you, Catherine and Alex, based on what's happening in the US. Probably you can give us your perspective on that.
Sure, I'd be happy to go. So I think there's some big opportunities here for geothermal for sure. The biggest is really marketing. You know, the industry organizations, both globally and by countries, I think have a big opportunity to be a part of this change. And it's really a matter of communicating. We do a great job communicating internally and connecting internally with others within our industry. And I think there's a big opportunity to expand our communications and our outreach and be a part of the conversation that's happening. So there's conversations around the future of the grid. There's conversations around the grid mix. And I think making sure that we are a part of these external conversations is really important. Another thing that I think is a big opportunity is just that these governments are really interested in things that can make a big impact. So if they look at hydrothermal potential in their country, it often looks pretty small as a percentage of their demand and their need for power. And so making sure that we think big and we talk big and go big and show that we're that, we can make geothermal into a manufacturing process so that each project isn't a new design. I think that's an important message that governments want to hear. And the third is speed. And so they want this change and they want it pretty quickly. And so if the geothermal industry isn't quick enough to pivot and be able to meet those needs on the timelines that they're looking for, then it will be left behind. And so how do we transition and pivot quickly and step up to meet their needs as quickly as they're expecting it?
Thank you very much, Catherine. Alex, you want to add on to that?
Sure. Yeah. I think Kate made a lot of great points about communication and thinking big. And I mean, geothermal from a research and R&D standpoint has been historically underfunded in the US, at least compared to some other clean energy technologies like wind and solar, for example. And we have a big opportunity right now in the US Congress. There's a bipartisan package that's moving through Congress that would provide a lot of funding, a huge injection of capital to get some large scale, large scale demonstration projects funded. Projects that were actually funded, that were authorized by the Bipartisan Energy Act of 2020 that passed at the end of last year. So, but the geothermal industry has to make the value proposition, has to be as ambitious as some of the other trade associations for the other clean energy technologies are. ClearPath is part of Geothermal Rising, which is the primary geothermal trade association in the United States, and we work on the policy committee, and a large part of what we do is try to work with Congress to secure additional funding to get some of these advanced geothermal projects financed so you can de-risk and scale the technology. Because there's a great story to tell in terms of the last several years from an innovation standpoint, where the Department of Energy funded the Forge site in Milford, Utah, after an exhaustive multi-year competitive process. That's a $150 million research, testing, and drilling site that is that's now just getting underway and is going to lead to a lot of breakthrough advances in geothermal technology. We have to sell that story and then say, okay, well, what's the next step? The next step is we need demonstration projects so that we can de-risk the technology and attract private sector funding. So I totally agree with what Kate said. We really have to make the case, and fortunately now is the perfect time to do it.
Thank you very much for that. Rosalind, maybe you can share some perspectives based on New Zealand and probably what's happening in the Pacific and in general the island countries.
Sure. So I think some of the points from a New Zealand perspective, we're very lucky that our electricity supply is already about 85% renewable, and we're pushing to get that to 90% by 2025. So for us, a lot of the opportunity in geothermal is actually not so much in the electric space. It's really around process heat and decarbonizing process heat and industrial uses of heat. And that really, the direct use of heat is almost geothermal's kind of superpower advantage that none of the other renewable technologies can offer at that sort of efficiency or scale. But I'm also mindful of the whole conversation about net zero. So geothermal in New Zealand is really taking ownership of the question that geothermal, while typically very, very good carbon-wise, is not always net zero. Flash plants do have some emissions from their operations. So our industry in New Zealand is really leaning into that and providing annual updates on what the actual CO2 emissions from our plants are, acknowledging that not all technologies are absolutely zero emission, and really trying to take ownership of that, because I think if we don't, we do risk a lot of issues around challenges from wind and solar on the sort of carbon emissions perspective. And in terms of the Pacific, I mean, I think there is still great opportunities for geothermal to help decarbonize the Pacific. The small island states are very dependent on imported diesel. Many of them would have some geothermal potential. So I'm hoping New Zealand can start to work with them more on that.
Thank you very much for those perspectives. Paul, maybe you can also let us know what's happening in the Netherlands and also in the European Union, particularly with the introduction of the Green Deal.
Yes, thank you, Jack. And yeah, maybe reflecting on what you said in terms of opportunities that let's say all these developments would offer. I think it's not only about opportunities; it's rather a necessity that we develop geothermal and also other renewables. And probably many of you have heard about the roadmap that the International Energy Agency has issued only a few months ago, net zero by 2050, where basically they're already stating that already by this year, no new gas or oil developments should be developed, or neither coal mines. So that is, I would say, a massive statement in a way. If we want to reach our climate goals, if we want to reach net zero by 2050, then we need alternatives. And that means not only alternatives on the electricity side, on the power side, but also on the heating side. And for Europe, for instance, the heating chunk of the final energy consumption is definitely the larger chunk. So it's 50% or more. And if you count the cooling, let's say in the south of Europe to it, then it's even more. So while many discussions are still focusing, I would say, too much on power, I think we really need to look into heat much more than we do. And I think that's crucial. I see many good developments, let's say, in many countries in Europe with regards to renewable electricity. But the heating side and the heating is still, I would say, to a large extent, 80–90% fossil fuel based. And there we don't have many opportunities. We don't have many alternatives. In a continent as Europe, in some countries we might have some biomass, but of course, if you burn biomass, you're also emitting CO2. It's just not the fossil biomass that you're burning, but it's the new biomass. And in a country as the Netherlands, we have one forest in a way, which is our national park. So, if we want to move in that direction, we are still dependent. We don't have many opportunities, other alternatives. And geothermal is in a way abundant, but we never looked into it. So we are not the volcanic ring of fire. We are not Iceland, let's say. Iceland has done the job. They're 100% renewable in a way. They are funding the few houses. They're subsidizing the few people that need to rely on fossil fuels because they live too far away. But the rest of Europe is still in a totally different position. But we can change that. And the prognosis now is somehow that at least 50%, let's say, of Europe could be heated by district heating. And probably half of that could use geothermal as a source. So that's really massive. But I think we really need to work together to bring that about. And we need to work together soon. And that's what we try to do within this geothermal framework, for instance. And this is what we try to do in the Netherlands. And maybe if I may, just one addition, we are closing our largest natural gas field in Groningen in the Netherlands, which is one of the largest in Europe, next year by 2022. We had issues with seismicity there, huge issues, but it's also, end of lifetime. We had hoped to have it open by 2030. It's not going to happen. We are closing it next year. We will become from a net exporter, we are becoming an importer. So we need other solutions. And people are realizing, not only in Netherlands, that, the times are changing. And we are having opportunities to change it, but we really need to work together here.
And Paul, you are exactly right. I mean, we have a massive opportunity to decarbonize heavy industry. Like in the United States, there's a number of major steel companies, for example, that have come out and have set ambitious targets. Some of them are net zero, some of them are a 30% reduction by 2030, et cetera. And which in itself is pretty significant, that you have these heavy industrial users that are making voluntary commitments. And obviously they use a lot of heat. And there are not a lot of ways to get clean heat. Geothermal is one of the most reliable, flexible, dispatchable technologies out there that can be deployed today. And the industrial decarbonization space has a lot of white space, and it's still in its infancy from some perspective, at least from an R&D and investment standpoint. So this is a perfect opportunity for geothermal to show its value proposition beyond the power sector as the world looks to accelerate the decarbonization of heavy industry.
Yeah, if I may reflect on that, Alex, I totally agree with what you're saying. And maybe to give a little bit, of European perspective, the city of Munich, for instance, is south of Germany, which is, a multi-million city. They are on the head of decarbonizing, and they also want a fully decarbonized and fully renewable supply, not only on the electricity side, but also on the heating side. And they had the ambition to do so by 2040. But they have even now decided to do so by 2035 already. And this is relying mainly on geothermal. And for instance, in my country, the city of The Hague, is now starting its first geothermal project. Tomorrow, actually, one of the major oil companies, Shell, that's based in the Netherlands, will start its first geothermal drilling in the north of the Netherlands, city of Leeuwarden. So many things are changing. There is a huge dynamics here going on. And I think really our cities will change over the course of the years. And, actually the first project we had in the Netherlands, the first geothermal project, it was back in 2007, was in the very south, in a coal mining area, where they used the old coal mines that were closed down in the 70s of last century. And they use the heat from the coal mines to heat the city. So it's the mine water project. They drilled down 800 meters. They used to use it to heat the city, to cool the buildings as well from lower levels. And that, in a way, is a very nice image to me. I think, you're transitioning towards a cleaner future based on the past. And this is true, I would say, also for geothermal in general. There is so much knowledge out there in the oil and gas industries. And, at the same time, this will change. So if we can use that knowledge, if we can use these people, and all this enthusiasm and knowledge out there, then I think we can really make that change quite quickly. But we need to work together on that. And governments need to provide the proper framework to be able to move in the right direction. I think that's important as well.
Yeah, I agree with you, Paul. I just want to follow up on the last statement that you said about the governments. And I think that that a lot of times geothermal coming into areas is either coming into an area that hasn't had geothermal, that maybe doesn't have regulations, where the public isn't as aware of it. And it sort of makes geothermal this uninvited guest, and it makes people uncomfortable, not because of its impact, but because of this uncertainty and because of the lack of knowledge. And so if we can communicate better with governments and with utilities, and from the heating perspective with builders and building communities, and have them be knowledgeable about geothermal and make sure the regulations are there and the policies are there, it turns it to an invitation, right? Come join our community and come be a part of what we're doing. Come be a part of this building project and development that we're working on. And so I think that's where the communication is really key, because turning that into an invitation can have a huge impact on the success of a project.
Yeah, I would really fully agree there. And I think it's really, a change to what we're used to, because we're used to electricity and gas, at least in my country, that is being delivered to you. And somebody out there is doing it for you. You just switch it on, you turn it on, it works. But people don't realize. And now the future will be different. It will be much more regional and local solutions. And if you talk about geothermal, for instance, it's under our feet. So you have to involve the people. You should involve the people. It's not a oil company that's far away or a gas company far away. You really have to interact with the people. So it's a totally different dynamics. But I think it's really exciting. So it's a new world in a way. It's a new way of working together. But if you do that, if you can really have people participating, communities participating in your projects, then you have a solution, that's your own somehow. It's not money flowing anywhere in the world.
Recording
it's just,
stopped.
you know, doing it here.
Yes, I would like to follow up on a few things that you've mentioned. You've talked about licensing. You've also talked about communication. So let me begin first of all with licensing. So this is an issue that has been around for quite a while, but it still keeps coming up as a thorn in the flesh of the developers. And all of it come from countries that have done quite well with regard to the development of geothermal. The US is the leading producer of geothermal electricity. And New Zealand has gotten to over 1,000 megawatts of electricity. And also the Netherlands is coming up, especially on the heating side. So the question that I would want to ask is, what is it that your countries have been doing to support the developers, particularly when it comes to acquiring the licenses? And what are some of the things that are coming up, for example, in the new legislations that are being introduced into the different
Recording in progress.
that are being introduced? What are some of the trends or some of the key elements that you're noticing in these legislations that you think are going to make it much easier for the developers to get into geothermal in terms of licensing?
Yeah, well, you know, in the U.S., I mean, permitting is one of the major challenges for geothermal, and it has been for for quite some time. The GeoVision study that US DOE did, that I know Kate worked on, which really showed the potential to accelerate geothermal capacity expansion if you can address these regulatory and permitting challenges. I mean, it can take 8 to 10 years to fully permit a geothermal project, which is just unacceptable if we are going to meet some of our, if we're going to meet our global climate goals. And particularly do it in ways that where we maintain a resilient grid, right? But one of the lessons that we can learn from this is the experience of the oil and gas industry in the United States. So the oil and gas industry, obviously, the US is now the #1 producer of oil and natural gas in the world. And that didn't just happen by accident, right? There were technological breakthroughs, but it's also a story about permitting, where in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which before the Energy Act of 2020 was one of the last major bipartisan energy policies that passed in the United States, the Energy Policy Act of 2005 created a rebuttable presumption and categorical exclusion from the National Environmental Policy Act for unconventional oil and gas drilling. Many of those same techniques are applied in geothermal. And yet, geothermal does not have the same categorical exclusion. So they have to go through the entire NEPA review process, which can take years, sometimes close to a decade. That's unacceptable. But it comes from partially from a lack of familiarity, as Kate was saying, a lack of awareness in communities of what geothermal is. State and local governments, federal government, even the federal government is not used to dealing with as much geothermal activity as they were with oil and gas. So this is something that should have bipartisan support. It's something that we're working on at ClearPath, which is trying to have sensible permitting policies that say, yes, we need environmental protections, but we also need to get projects built, because you can do all the R&D in the world, but if you can't permit the project, then you're just doing science experiments.
Yeah, and I'll just follow up on that and say that in all of the analysis we did, some of the things that we observed, not just in geothermal, but in things from transportation to bridges and other big construction projects, is that the more detailed you make any permit or license or leasing process, the more challenging it becomes, because each project is unique. And so if each project has to have exceptions, that can help to expand the permitting process as well. And so what we found was that governmental entities that had simplified, more generic permitting and regulatory processes allowed for that flexibility without having to sacrifice any of the safety or the concerns that they needed. And so that's really one of the key takeaways. And that's where this categorical exclusion comes in, is it's really sort of streamlining and simplifying the process without taking away any of the safety. It's based on science and previous knowledge and previous experience.
Yeah, and New Zealand is probably then at the other end of the spectrum in terms of the simplicity of our regulatory framework. We nearly 30 years ago harmonized all our sort of permitting processes essentially into a single act of government legislation, our Resource Management Act, and that has harmonized everything. It does have its critics like anything, but for projects that are deemed to be of national significance, those projects are permitted within 12 months. So our most recent geothermal project, our most recent electricity development, Tahara is on the order of a $300 million US development to generate electricity, was permitted within 12 months. And that really reduces business risk, uncertainty, and just makes it so much easier for developers to go forward.
Sounds like we could learn a few things from you guys.
Come on down.
And of course, I mean, it's so much more complicated in the US because we have states and localities and the federal government. There's federal public land and there's private land and state held land. And in the oil and gas experience, I mean, oil and gas drilling that occurred on state and private land got permitted dramatically faster than it did on federal land. So when we're talking about expanding geothermal permit and accelerating permitting for geothermal, we have to keep in mind that yes, we need to streamline the federal permitting process for public land, and then we need to provide technical assistance to states that are looking to expand to do geothermal the right way, so that permitting does not continue to be a roadblock to more geothermal development.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a really good point. Oftentimes geothermal projects are have to deal with multiple entities because the land that they need has to deal with both federal, state, private, local governmental entities. And so there are states that have processes. Alaska is one of them, where they have offices to help coordinate all of the different jurisdictions into a more streamlined process. And that's really helpful and impactful as well.
Yeah,
maybe if I
Paul, I want to ask you regarding the Netherlands, and more specifically about heating, because a lot of countries they have geothermal resources that are more suitable for heating than for electricity generation, and Netherlands is a very good example of this. So in terms of licensing, what is it that the Netherlands has been doing? And maybe you can also connect this with the fact that it's a country that is transitioning from oil and gas to the use of geothermal. What are some of the aspects of the oil and gas that Netherlands has tried to bring to geothermal to make it easier to license the projects?
Yeah, I would say in terms of licensing, we had a mining law that was changed in the early 2000s to include geothermal, but very much based on the oil and gas kind of procedures. But we found out actually that it would be useful to simplify it or to adapt it for geothermal. And this is now in process, basically, in the Netherlands. But I think, although licensing is always kind of an issue, I would say, and if I look around Europe, it is an issue, but it's not the only issue, I would say. So we do have a lot of applications, for instance, at the moment. So that's also one reason that it takes time, and we're a densely populated country. So you have the provinces and the cities that have a say in that. But at the end of the day, I think that will probably move forward, and there are also European initiatives to harmonize that. But I think other elements that are also important and that helps very much, for instance, in the Netherlands is in the Netherlands, our mining data are public. within 5 years after any drilling, all the mining data from oil and gas becomes public. So all the 2D, 3D seismics, but also borehole loggings, everything you can access online. You go on the internet right now, nlog.nl, you can find everything. You know, every borehole in the Netherlands, etc. And that, of course, helps a new industry like geothermal tremendously, because you don't have to invest multi-million. You know, this is a multi-billion, I think, worth of data that's out there in the public space. And that's not the case for all European countries. But for instance, Germany has just passed a law that they are moving in that direction as well. And I think that's, for instance, also a quite important step to make it happen. And then reflecting on the heating transition, you could call it, because we are kind of moving away from natural gas. So we need a solution there. And just to give you an impression, now all our municipalities in the Netherlands, they are in a process of preparing, they all have to prepare heat transition visions. So how will they transition from natural gas into a renewable alternative by 2050 and already by 2030 on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis? So all these municipalities are now thinking about this, and you know, they have to cope with all these kind of issues. Okay, what are the alternatives? Can geothermal be an alternative, etc.? And this process is taking place right now. We haven't solved everything yet, but it really creates a lot of dynamics. But to make it happen, you need also the right framework. And just to give an example, for instance, many countries do have introduced in the past feed-in tariffs for renewable electricity. But on the heating side, for instance, there hasn't been done so much. And we, in the Netherlands, we introduced the feed-in premium. Basically, we widened it also to renewable heating. That means including geothermal. And that was a crucial step, I would say, to make it happen. Because, of course, at the end of the day, you need a business case, you know, as long as the fossil alternatives are still cheaper, then you need to support it, or you need regulations to fix it. And maybe one other element that helped also a lot is a risk mitigation scheme that we put up nationally to cope with the geological risk, up to 85%. So that makes it easier for any developer to somehow step into this new area without somehow, you know, taking tremendous risk. So it's a multiple, I would say, set of instruments that governments can apply. And last but not least, like Alex, I think you mentioned this very, very strongly, the innovation part. I think innovation is key to this kind of developments. And definitely in innovation, we can work together quite a lot. But at the end of the day, we need these large-scale demo projects. I think that is when people can see and feel it. And I remember back in 2007, you know, I worked for 7 years on geothermal. Then there was the first project. And then people went there, they could burn their hand, you know, and it was hot. And then they only started to believe that geothermal could be possible in the Netherlands, because, you know, ministers would go there, members of parliament would go there. They could feel it. And then they realized it can be done, you know, and that somehow sparked, I would say, the transition. And we need much more of that. Yeah.
Seeing is believing, and it also helps create political momentum to get projects built, right? Which is what you need at that scale. If you can say, well, this funding will go to support X project in your state or in your city, right? That always helps. But you know, our R&D, our D&D is necessary, certainly, and it's the foundation, but it's necessary but not sufficient, right? We need some of these other policy mechanisms, these non-technical barriers, whether it's permitting or the right financial incentives, right? So thinking about, like in the United States, we have production tax credits for various clean energy technologies. Geothermal has kind of gotten short shrift over the years. So at ClearPath, we're trying to work on some of that to have a technology inclusive, it's called the Energy Sector Innovation Credit. That would basically be a tech neutral, tech inclusive approach that would scale down as market penetration increases. We're hopeful, as you know, tax credits can be controversial, politically controversial, but we're hoping that this pretty elegant approach to have a a self phase out of the tax credit as a given technology increases in market penetration can actually get some bipartisan support, because then you can get some of these first of a kind demo projects financed and built out, and that's when you can really start to drive down the cost and start to compete with combined cycle natural gas and maybe even wind and solar one day.
Yeah, fully agree with that. Yeah.
Well,
I just wanted to, sorry.
I was just curious about the risk mitigation scheme. I mean, I think that's a really important role of government and government agencies in different countries. But looking around the world, there's a range of risk mitigation schemes coming from governments, and some are working really well and some are not. So yeah, curious maybe to learn more about how the scheme is working in the Netherlands.
Yeah, I mean, a bit of a tough question in the sense that we have limited time here, but basically, you know, you're paying a premium and you get an insurance up to 85% of the investment. That's it, you know, and it's based on a P90 value basically, and we have calculation methods for that. And we pretty much copied this from the French that had it in place already a longer time. And France is actually working on a newer scheme now that will also include, let's say, lesser known regions, et cetera, and we might go that direction as well. So many countries in Europe have taken this on now, and it's really proven to be helpful, I think. So happy to discuss more details anytime, but yeah, maybe in this framework it might go a bit too far.
I'm thinking of some of the schemes sort of through Africa and Asia, which I think are struggling to take.
Yeah, in our case, we really asked for basically for a premium on the government side, so people are paying for this. But you know, and basically it's net zero insurance, and we've been able to do it. But we see that the commercial insurers haven't stepped into it yet, because the market was not big enough or is not big enough. So that's why we are taking that role as an insurer at the moment. And at the end of the day, I think the government role is not, in the long run, you know, hopefully we are not needed. This will stand on its own feet. But, you know, to get things started, I think governments are crucial to somehow, you know, move it in the right direction, to have the right framework. And also, like Alex, I think what you said, these large scale demos, this just innovation for innovation or R&D is not enough. It's like la voila, you know. So you really need to show that it can be done. You really need to have that demonstration. And for instance, in the framework of Geothermal, this cooperation, which is basically on innovation, but it's innovation to spark implementation. And just to give you one example, one of our flagship projects from the first call is a project called Heat Store. And I think that's another element we're not discussing so much yet, but the storage, geothermal storage capacity of the underground, you know, to bridge from winter to summer and store the heat basically there. That's also a tremendous opportunity here. And this project, for instance, is a project where I think over 6 or 7 countries are working together, really showing it, having multiple demos combined with the research part, and people will be able to see it. You know, the first projects have been realized, and already now this has put the heat store topic, the heat storage topic, thermal storage topic on the map, I would say, and on the political agenda. So it's very important that we do things like that.
Oh, and Paul, I mean, thermal storage is such an overlooked use case for geothermal, but we know that long duration grid scale storage, even seasonal storage, is going to be necessary to integrate larger amounts of wind and solar on the grid. We know that existing technologies, you know, existing battery technologies are not sufficient for long duration storage. So there's a race to develop multi-day energy storage systems at scale. And there's a lot of technological approaches you can take. You can have, you know, various battery chemistries, advanced batteries, and there's a number of those out there. But thermal storage is also a promising technology, and geothermal is thermal storage. So back to the first point that Kate made, which is that the geothermal industry has to do a better job advocating for itself, right? It's not just about using geothermal for power production, but also for thermal heat for heavy industry and long duration grid scale storage. So geothermal has the potential to sit right at the epicenter of some of the most dramatic transitions that we're seeing in the energy sector that, they're going to be necessary to meet all of our climate goals. So I think the technology is there. We just need to invest in the R&D and just make the business case for it.
Yeah, and just talking more about R&D, I would also just want to touch a bit about the work that is going on with regard to the EGS and how much the government is investing in this. Maybe, Kate, you could provide some insights on this with regard to what's happening in the US.
Yeah, so as Alex mentioned, and Alex is probably a little bit closer to this than I am at this point, but the U.S. has developed an EGS site, Forge, in Milford, Utah, and is focused not only on developing EGS projects and advancing the technologies at that site, but also currently has a wells of opportunity. So looking at current wells that are existing and seeing if there's other opportunities for testing advanced downhole tools and other things at higher temperatures at locations throughout the US. So there's a lot going on in that area. What's really exciting is to see not just universities participating and national labs participating in this research, but also startups and small businesses and large companies, because really what this needs to move forward is moving beyond that RD&D phase into the development and deployment phases. And so it's important to have those industry partners to be able to continue the research beyond where the government RD&D ends.
Yeah,
Alex, I don't know if you have something to add to that.
Okay, I would like to us to take some questions from the audience. One is regarding the incentives that the governments are giving for energy sources. And the audience is wondering why isn't the same incentives that are being given to other renewable energy sources being extended to geothermal? Any responses on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's not that those types of policies haven't been extended to geothermal. It's that policies that apply to a technology like solar and wind aren't necessarily applicable to geothermal. So if we take the production tax credit that Alex mentioned earlier, it's available for solar, it's available for wind, it was available for geothermal too, but the difference is it was extended, it was implemented for a year at a time. And so if you implement a production tax credit for a year, projects that are going to take less than a year will be incentivized to deploy and get their projects on the grid online in that year. But if a geothermal project sees that it's going to expire in a year and it's going to take them 4 years to be deployed, it's not going to incentivize them. It won't enable that deployment because it's not designed for geothermal. And so just following up on Alex's point, that there is this, that there is pushback against incentives like this, but I think it's really an important point to make that RD&D can take us to the point of technology demonstration, but that's not commercialization. And so getting that technology commercialized requires some sort of pull from the other side to get it over that valley of death. And that's really where these incentives can help drive investment by industry and drive investment by outside investors so that we can get the technology from that technical demonstration standpoint to the commercialization standpoint. And we've seen that happen for technologies. We've seen that these production tax credits and other incentives have driven industry into the other technologies, which then has driven the cost down for these other technologies, making the incentives a moot point. They're not necessary at that point. And that's really what Alex was driving that, is that it's this temporary pull in the market to get over that valley of death. And that's why I think they're so critical to the story of advancing technology.
And that that point you made around ensuring certainty from a financing standpoint is so critical, because you saw with the wind and solar production tax credits, whenever those tax credits were about to expire, you saw a dramatic rise in wind and solar projects being built right before the expiration of the credit. You can't do that with geothermal. Because as we mentioned, it takes so much longer to permit and build these projects. You need that financial certainty. But I think almost all of the pieces are there to go from the early stage research to the large scale to the large scale demo projects to the commercialization. I mean, we have the Forge site, we had the GeoVision study. We're actively, DOE is actively funding projects. We're close to getting an infusion of funding from Congress to get some large scale demonstration projects. We see a path forward on a tech inclusive tax credit that avoids picking winners and losers and supports all forms of clean energy. And then if we can just get some bipartisan agreement on the permitting, those are basically all the pieces that you need to accelerate geothermal so that geothermal can play a significant role in our clean, in our clean energy transition. It's all there. We just got to do it.
Okay, thank you for that. I think we still have a couple of more questions that I would just like to touch on before I see the time is coming to a close. So regarding getting the people to accept geothermal more. So I think in New Zealand, they have done quite a good job with getting the local communities involved in geothermal development. We've seen the local communities being involved particularly in the development of direct users. Maybe Rosalind, you can just give us some perspectives on what's happening in New Zealand in terms of how the government has been able to bring the communities to accept geothermal.
Certainly, yes. So geothermal in New Zealand is typically found on Maori owned land. Maori are the indigenous people of New Zealand. So the communities are absolutely integral to the projects, often as true economic partners in the projects. And there are trusts and these sorts of things that do have quite significant asset bases and are actually investing jointly in geothermal projects and using those dividends to reinvest in their local communities. So we're in quite a unique position, I guess, in New Zealand because of that shared community ownership in many of our projects.
Thank you for that. And just Paul, in the case of Netherlands, as you're trying to bring geothermal closer to the people for heating the buildings, what role are particularly the cities are playing in order to get the people to be more accepting of geothermal?
That's a very good question, and I was really inspired by your answer, Rosalind. I think how you're doing it in New Zealand. I think that's very interesting. I think we are somehow still searching for the right model or the right models, and in a way, we see different kind of developments. We see on the one hand side, we the first geothermal projects in the Netherlands were with greenhouse farmers. So they really were the pioneers, that were very proactive. They took the decisions themselves. They were very brave people. They were not necessarily geologists or whatever, but they did it and they made it happen. They made the change. And what we see now is that, as I said, the bigger players are coming in. Shell is starting to drill tomorrow. But at the same time, also municipalities are looking into this. How should we arrange it? Should it be the big players? Should we have around, utility companies? And you have to know that we privatized all our utility companies in the 90s, so of last century. And now somehow we see a rebound, a reverse effect. And many municipalities are considering, establishing utilities again. And I think in many of the cases where they did so, it's closer to the people, and probably in the long term, this is the key to success, to have the shared ownership, to have it closer to the people. And of course, you can involve, experienced industry, but you need somehow, it shouldn't be only money flowing out, to some external group. People should really feel that it's happening under their feet. It should be safe, and they should be profiting from it. And you need to find a solution for that. And we're in the search for that. So happy to hear any good suggestions how to solve this.
Thank you very much for that response. And the next question is regarding more of a skills and knowledge transfer to developing countries. And the question that I have is, your countries have done quite a lot in terms of developing the skills and the human capacity. But in terms of reaching out to other developing countries, impacting these skills, what is it that your countries are doing in this regard? Maybe Rosalind, can start with you.
Sure. The New Zealand aid program through our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade are very active in human capability development and geothermal around the world. I lead a program in East Africa that has, of course, gone online in the past 18 months. We also work very closely with geothermal professionals in the ASEAN region, in Indonesia and the Philippines, bringing them to New Zealand pre-COVID, but still working online. So it's a real priority for our aid program.
Okay, thank you very much. I wish we had more time to continue the question, but I think at this time we just have to bring it to a close. And I will ask each of you to just give us your closing remarks in just 1 minute. Then we shall go to the next step and close the session. So Kate, you'd like to go first again?
Sure. I just wanted to thank everyone for the great discussion today, and just highlight that communication is key. Working with governments and utilities so that there is an invitation for geothermal to come and partner. I think those are my two big takeaways, and I'll leave it at that since I know we're out of time. But thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
I'd say the single most important thing for people to take away is that geothermal is the only renewable resource that can provide reliable, clean electricity, heat, and storage. So it has to be a critical part of our future.
Thank you for that. Paul?
Yeah, I very much agree with what Alex said. I think that is crucial to realize. We need to change. We are still heating our homes, heating our industries fossil-based. That will have to change in 30 years' time, and geothermal must be an important part of the equation there. And maybe taking it even further, I think now wherever you're working, you can you can join in. This is probably the time to join in if you haven't done so yet. And I see this happening. We just hired a new colleague that came out of Oman from the oil and gas industry that made that change somehow, and this is happening all over. So I think this is exactly also societally what should be happening and what is happening, and a lot of young people, but also retired people coming in, bringing their expertise, and we'll make this change happen together. And enjoyed this conversation with all of you. Thanks for that.
Thank you. Rosalind?
Yeah, I think the whole conversation just for me highlights the need for everyone to be having a really joined up dialogue between industry, academia, government, communities to just get everything aligned to make this transition possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody, for this wonderful session, and thank you very much for your contribution. I also want to thank our audience for taking your time to be with us and to listen to our discussion. I hope everybody has gotten something, and that the outcomes of this will really go a long way in supporting general development around the world. So with that, I thank you all and wish you a good time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.